Welcome back, everybody, to the Smooth Brain Society. Today, we're taking a little shift away from the most recent episodes, which have all been around neuroscience, and we're going to be talking about sport, which is really exciting because I think this saying has been hashed out multiple times by different people, but it goes along the lines of sport is the most important of the least important things in the world, and I love it as well. And I'm sure most people do to some extent or the other. So we're going to talk about it, and we're going to talk in particular about women in sport. And for that, we have Erin Roxburgh on. Is it Roxburgh or Roxburgh?
Oh, Roxburgh. Yeah, you nailed it.
Yeah,
Like
Roxburgh.
Edinburgh.
Yeah, because it's spelled like Edinburgh, so I pronounced it that way, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
so we've
perfect.
got Erin Roxburgh on, who is the Deputy Chair of Women in Sport New Zealand. She is a lecturer in sports management at Victoria University, also a PhD student at Victoria University, the future Director of Sport New Zealand, a board member of Netball Wellington Centre, and is also a New Zealand Women's International Beach Handball and regular handball squad member. So we've got not only an academic, but a professional sportswoman coming to speak to us. So welcome to the Smooth Brain Society, Erin.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
And if anyone's new to the podcast, the way it works is we have a co-host on as well who usually has no idea about the topic and is thrown in the deep end. To be fair, I'm also have no idea about Erin's work, so I'm in the deep end as well. But thank you, Lily, for joining us. If you could introduce yourself to everybody.
Kia ora, ko Lily joina tōku ingoa. I actually know Erin quite well, so I'll have to think of things that I already know answers to, or maybe things that I don't know answers to. But cool to be on the podcast. I work in community sports. I work for a local organisation here in Wellington called Nuku Ora, and we advocate for physical activity across the region and all things movement for well-being. And I also play football, but not at a professional level, very much social.
Well, in honor of Erin coming on here, I'm wearing my handball top from the time I used to play for Victoria University. It fits a little bit tighter now, but is what it is. So Erin, let's start where we start with most of our guests. Could you give us a little bit of a background into yourself? So your journey into how you decided to work in sports management and sort of your sporting background in general.
Yeah, sure. So I was really lucky that my dad and mum were both really, really into sport growing up. And I think that really has facilitated a lot of what I do now. Like some really early memories I have of sport are not actually about me playing sport, it's watching my dad playing sport, and not even watching my dad. For anyone who's familiar with Alexmoor Park in Johnsonville, my earliest memories of sport are sliding down the hills there on cardboard boxes while my dad was playing cricket. But I guess for me, something that's probably always been really ingrained into me from my dad is he always made sure that it was always about having fun and creating a community for other people to be a part of. I'm really lucky in that a role model that I've had is someone who's always played in my dad has played in first 11s, but was always on the, he was always on the committee. He was helping coach. And actually my Auntie Julie, who's sadly no longer with us, had quite severe epilepsy, but she was always at the game. She learned how to score cricket, and there's memories of her coming to the game, my dad's games, and she one time had grazes on both of her knees, but she'd had a seizure on the way, but still made it to the game. And the cricket club scoreboard at Johnsonville was actually named after her. So yeah, I have a lot of memories of sport being something that was all about fun and helping other people. And so I throughout high school played lots of sports. I was never in any of like the top teams, but I played netball and football, and I had horses, so I did horse riding as well. And yeah, at school I used to coach and all that kind of stuff as well. And then when I came to university, I started playing at Team Vic Netball Club, which is it's a huge club. It had about 26 teams, and that's where I started playing Prem netball, and then coaching other women. And I guess I started to say that it was a spot that like people played because they liked playing, but also they were new to Wellington. They were new to Wellington. They didn't know people, And something you probably get from the podcast is I'm like quite severely extroverted. And so a social committee person came up available, and I was like, hey, I love planning a party. I love bringing people together. So I did that, and that was probably my first experience with, I guess, which is probably something I'm going to tie into with governance, thinking about how we can change communities for the better through sport. And yeah, from there it all just kind of took off, and then I started playing handball, joined the Wellington Handball Committee, and then from there New Zealand Handball Federation. I did some advocacy work around when I used to play beach handball. We used to have to wear bikinis, if you can believe that. Did some advocacy work around that, and it made me think about, actually, you know what, like positional titles seem to get you into spaces, and I was able to talk and do some advocacy work around that, and I realized I kind of did have a voice. And yeah, so I'm still playing sport to this day, still playing pre-netball, indoor handball, beach handball. And what's really awesome that I see now is just we had this crop of young women coming through who will never have to wear bikinis, and that I get to mentor. So yeah, I mean, like a lot of athletes, so I play self-entered prem netball now, so we don't train twice a week. But yeah, I guess for any other university students watching this, or people still trying to play sport, because it's all fairly pseudo-professional here, and we all are self-funding, it's a hard graft, training 5 or 6 times a week, playing a netball game on Saturday, a handball game on Sunday, and then having to show up at work battered and bruised on a Monday. But yeah, I guess one of my favourite quotes that articulates what I think sport is all about, and I think we're going to talk about, is I think sport is the lens, through which we can see, understand, and solve social issues. So yeah, I'm very passionate about that. The sport management lecturing, so my PhD is actually looking in Māori governance, but I got into lecturing sport management because I started teaching at Vic Uni, came on in my full-time lecturer position about 3 years ago, and our head of school said, hey, Erin, we need another 300 level management course. You're into sport, aren't you? Like, do you want to resurrect our sport management paper? And as a first-year academic, I was like, why not? Opportunity of a lifetime. And I was like, where do I even start? But I have a fantastic mentor in Dr. Sarah Lieberman, who is a professor of sports leadership at Massey and just the ultimate goat of women's sport. She is a Te Tiriti ally, and we sat in a taxi after a board meeting one day, and she helped me plan out what my course could look like. So big credit. Her mana flows through the way that I teach sport management, for sure. So I guess my journey is probably not unlike any other people's, other than that I had a very privileged upbringing and parents who could always drive me to and from games, buy me new sports shoes, pay for my fees. And I've been lucky enough to come across other people ahead of me who, were happy to share the positional power they had, which is something we don't always see in sport either.
Oh, that's an awesome journey, and I can relate to a lot of it. The pseudo professional thing is very true, and it was one thing which surprised me when I first came back to New Zealand. When I came back to New Zealand to do my university, because in India you're sort of training 5-6 times a week if you're playing cricket or hockey or whatever, and in most cases, if you make an under 16 squad team, you're paid. So when you're under 15, so you're 14-year-old, 15-year-old, you're getting paid some sort of money to play, to train. I don't, it's not a lot, but like it's, and then you come to New Zealand and you realize these professional athletes have day jobs, and they've like, and you've got, I think, was it Jeet Raval was a cricketer who had like on his bat, behind his cricket bat sticker, he had the company which he worked for advertised on it, because that was his job over the winter months. And I learned that a women's sport even worse, but even men's sport, like Ross Taylor, who, for, I know American audiences, I'm already losing them, or people who are not into cricket, but he is this cricketer who, I think he debuted, or he started playing cricket in like 2001, 2002, and he's regarded as the first full-time professional cricketer in New Zealand, because ever since the start of his career, he earned money till the end, while And you realize that that's such a privileged position, and that's men's sports. Then women's sports, again, like 3 or 4 steps further behind that. So yeah, that part just sort of relate. Yeah, I really related to that, being like how the difference between the two, between different countries, how sports is perceived. Um, but do you think that also changes your approach to how sports is? Like, would you think that sports would have been different if, suppose, people were getting paid at 15, 16, 17, or you were able to pay them at that age?
Oh, yeah, that's actually a question I never thought about. I mean, I think it does. And I don't know what experience you had in Lily in community sport, but yeah, I think it would have. I think it does change things. I think probably what that goes to talk to, if I could segue it, is actually thinking about the way that sport is funded and governed here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is quite unique. And yeah, Lily, you just jump in from a community perspective, because I'm just talking about this from an academic perspective, not necessarily having experienced it. But yeah, the way that our sports sector is funded here is very interesting. And I think even from a sporting franchise, so obviously in America, the way that sports franchises operate is very autonomous, and we see that New Zealand basketball mirrors a very same, more like commercialized US model. But actually, for most of our other sports franchises here in New Zealand, we kind of have this structure where you have sports franchises, and then they are directly controlled or report to their national sporting organisation. So, for example, because the money flows from obviously taxpayers and Class 4 lotteries commission, Class 4, what's called Class 4 gaming funding. So any place that has slot machines, I don't know what the appropriate term for them is, pokey machines, they have pokies, yeah, they then have a certain percentage, if they have license to operate, they then have a certain percentage of that that needs to be turned into grant money. And a lot of that then flows into the way community sport is funded here in Aotearoa. And ultimately, because of the pseudo-professionalism, even franchises who we see on TV are sometimes, their staff behind the scenes are funded by that Class 4 gaming funding. Because, again, and I'm not trying to speak ill of Sport New Zealand here, it is the system that we kind of operate in now, where we're quite reliant on that funding, and we don't really have a high commercialization model. I think that comes from the fact that through basically up until the late 90s, even the All Blacks weren't professional.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and so you kind of, sorry, I could get a bit nerdy on this, but there was a few different milestones. So we had, I'm sure everyone who lives overseas, or people who are really, and this is probably the first intersections, but have you guys heard of, of that, the neoliberalist movement? Basically, that led to the government here making changes which basically commodified sport. But because sport prior to that was not seen as a public good, I think we're still quite reliant on community funding, and it's hard to get commercial funding as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. You kind of see how reliant on even just that the kind of grassroots up rather than the top down approach, how reliant on that we are in Aotearoa. I mean, New Zealand rugby is probably the one that's the most commercial, and then maybe New Zealand cricket following, in terms of having, the Black Caps, the All Blacks, and having a commercial arm that helps to prop up community sport and the lower leagues. But then you've got pretty much every other sport, including New Zealand football, where participants who are playing at junior, youth, first kicks level are helping to fund the national body, which then helps to fund the professional team. So it's a pretty crazy time. And there's also things like the sinking lid policy, which I don't know if it's a nationwide thing. Do you know if it is, Erin? I think different councils have different policies around it, but especially in Wellington, we've got the sinking lid policy, which basically means no new pokey machines allowed to be installed, and so that's essentially putting a stop to the growth of that Class 4 gaming funding, and so it's a really tricky situation to be in, where you're kind of like, you see the the benefit that all of this money is having on the community and funding roles like mine. But then at the same time, it's like the harm that gambling does. This is such a tangent. I don't know why we've gone on this tangent, but it's so complicated.
It's so funny. I never knew that gambling funded, or well, partially funded sports in New Zealand. Well, particular type of gambling.
I want to say the statistic is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lily, is I think about 70% of the or like the sports sector here in Aotearoa is funded in some way, whether first or second hand through the Class 4 gaming funding. I think it's quite 70% or certainly like a substantial amount.
Yeah, and some of that is lotteries, so lotto, which is kind of seen as our more like mainstream and good gambling because a lot of more wealthier people do it potentially. So there's layers to it, and there's discussions between DIA, who are the sort of monitors of all that sort of gambling activity in New Zealand, and Sport NZ, the national body, around what's the future of that look like, and what are the ethical considerations. And so it's all very interesting to be involved in that discussion.
Does that also include sports betting, or just gambling and just pokies and lotto, or does it include any sort of sports gambling?
Yeah, it does include sports betting. Like, I know that when I was on the New Zealand Handball Federation board, one of the things that we were looking at is handball becoming a sport that people could bet on, and then what that meant is that directly money would then flow back into the New Zealand Handball Federation. And it is this really thing, to build off what Lily was saying, it's this really ironic thing where people are participating in gambling, which we ultimately don't necessarily want. But then for the New Zealand Handball Federation, we've been able to start a fund, which is a community grant fund, that anyone in New Zealand Handball can then apply to that fund to do any ideas or social initiatives they've had with grassroots handball. So we've seen it be able to fund different primary schools having access to handballs, paying people to go in and teach handball, getting them gear, when ultimately that money then flowed firstly around, obviously for a sport like handball, was really key for us to get that for the Olympics. So yeah, it's a really interesting funding model, and I think it does suck away a little bit of an ability. We don't, sport here in Aotearoa is not I wouldn't say is as commercial. And we think about it was even only until, I think it was until the Rugby World Cup in 1998 when the government at the time decided to have pay-to-view TV. The Rugby World Cup was one of the first sports to be a pay-to-view sport. Then money was flowing, I should say men's rugby was flowing into the sport, but that was only in the late 90s. So we're thinking not, maybe we've had 30 years of professionalism of sport here, whereas other countries, I think, it's been a lot longer. And we do, again, I think we are fairly oversaturated for sport. And I think in New Zealand as well, I think we do have which I love, a real mentality on not as much elitism in sport. Like, I think we have this thing like everyone can participate in sport, and I think most community sport, all sports, are funded and participated in by people who want to show up on a Saturday, and it's about getting everyone moving and that kind of stuff. So we have quite well, I would say this because this is my research, well, the thing I love, but I think it is a really interesting and unassumingly complex environment. And I guess probably I should preface that almost my 3 degrees are in commerce. So I definitely come at it from quite an organizational perspective, probably the lens through which I see things. But I think we have a really interesting sporting environment once you finally take the lid off. And I always start, one of my first classes is talking to the students about how the sports sector is funded and governed, because I think once you know that, you start to see everything in a really different way.
Yeah, well, my mind is blown completely, but I didn't know that this is how sort of the sporting structure worked. And I played sports in New Zealand for 10 years and multiple sports as well, but I didn't know that that's how sort of everything worked. But to pick on your commerce side a little bit further, and you were talking about sort of the ethical dilemma a little bit of sort of the sort of gambling being a big part of funding. How would you see New Zealand moving past it, or sort of improving that model because of the way the model currently is?
Oh, I have actually thought about this a few times. I think I've even had a chat with Lily about this. Look, I think it's really hard to say. I think that, and again, jump in if you like, Lily, as well, but I really see the model that New Zealand basketball is operating as something that's quite unique and innovative. And I'm sorry, I don't know much about the men's league funding, but so New Zealand basketball recently started it's been in operation now for 3 years, what's called the Tauihi League. So it was the women's basketball league. And I feel like they ran it in more of an autonomous way, where each franchise had far more autonomy from the national body. So, for example, in rugby, even the Hurricanes, a spot on their own top, they have to pay a lease for that particular space on their top to New Zealand Rugby. So there's always this money, like Lily was saying, flowing from the bottom up. But with the Tauihi League, each franchise was put out to market, and a consortium of buyers often came together to buy the franchise. And so I think there were a few things from the get-go where these franchises had to be able to be financially sustainable on their own. They had to guarantee pay parity with the men. But what that could enable them to do is look at funding their franchises in their own way. So it was kind of, I think, probably one of the first commercial sports models where we've seen that reliance come away from that funding. But obviously, I'm only speaking from, I mean, ideally, you would really like to think that the government could somewhere find money to put more of our taxes towards sport. But I think sometimes that can be really tricky because, like anything, we're all spectators of sport. So often the way that you can make more money out of sport is like, I hate using this word, but the glittery thing is professional sport, right? It's often people really take for granted the parents who take their 7-year-old kids down to the muddy park on a Saturday morning, even though that is the bulk of people that make up sport. So, you know, the thing around if we were to redistribute or think about the tax system, I think unfortunately it does start pouring into that elite level sport because that's ultimately where we can make more money out of it. You get viewers. So yeah, I think it would really require a huge shake-up. And I think possibly, and there's a really good, again, nerd vibes, there's a fantastic chapter that someone wrote in a sports academic handbook, which is a New Zealand-based one, where, you know, I think ultimately we'd really have to shift our perception of sport here in Aotearoa to justify that social value that sport does bring to everyday New Zealanders. Because I even know, so in women in sport Aotearoa, we find it really difficult. Like, I actually think it's been a long time since we've received any type of commercial funding that's not from the government, because people don't see advocating for women in sport as this like glittery thing. But what is a glittery thing is sponsoring a men's rugby team, you know, like, so I think there's a couple of ways. I think we need, you know, we'd have to have a bit of a shake up and think about where the money flows and redistribute that. But equally at the same time, I think that government and government policies only mirror the social license that they have in society. And I think still in New Zealand, the social license that we have here is that we really value men's rugby. Do you know what I mean? Like, just to put it bluntly, we value men's rugby. Even men, like, and I say men's rugby because I even find, like, you know, if I think about the role that the men's Phoenix team have played in Wellington,
So that's
they completely rejuvenated football here, right? Since they first came. And the Saints, every game you go to for the men's basketball game, it is pumping, it's kid friendly, they're high performing teams, but ultimately, at the end of the day, people don't get together to watch the Phoenix or the All Whites, they get together to watch the All Blacks. We have this real iconism associated with them, and I do feel like a lot of social license is given. And that's fair enough, and that's no disrespect to the men who play in that team, because they do a great job at it and representing us so well. And I guess, you know, sorry, I always take things from like a systems approach as well, but thinking about why that exists is not really a mystery, because we think that, you know, men's rugby has existed and been given a lot of airtime, you know, since the early 1900s. So we're trying to unpack a century of systemic beliefs and sports stuff around that. So, yeah.
so embedded in our culture as well, hey, the whole kind of full poppy syndrome and toxic masculinity and all those sort of negative things that that kind of have become a bit ingrained in sport culture, and maybe is what puts a lot of people off sport in Aotearoa as well. And so sports like football, basketball, a number of other sports are growing a lot more in terms of participation at a grassroots level. And people are often surprised when I say rugby is declining at a grassroots level, and it's women's rugby and young women's rugby that is increasing significantly more than the men's. Yeah, and I totally agree, and I think the government funding is a key piece, and even council funding. And it's really interesting to look at how over in Australia it's so much easier to get projects off the ground because they have that kind of unanimous agreement that sport is inherently part of being Australian and part of their culture, and that it's a good thing for all people. And so there's less barriers, and there's federal and state funding towards facilities and community initiatives on sport, which we just don't have here. And so there has to be targeted approaches from the likes of Sport NZ to put funding into young women's initiatives, or put funding into focusing on people with disabilities and those who aren't often considered. So yeah, it's interesting.
I'm very surprised by you saying that in Australia it's ingrained as sort of like sport is ingrained in them, but New Zealand also tends to, at least every time the Olympics comes around, or when you think about a population of 5 million, the number of sports New Zealanders generally perform well at is really high proportion to the rest of the world, right? Like the All Blacks, of course, the Black Caps tend to do really well in cricket more often than not. The hockey teams, they're called the Black Sticks, aren't they?
Yep.
Yeah, they I mean, they don't win trophies, but they compete at pretty high levels. They're always up in the Olympic quarterfinals and things like that. So, and then of course all the individual awards which people win in rowing, triathletes, blah blah blah. I would have thought that there would have been a bit more of a push from the New Zealand government behind the scenes than what you guys are saying.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Lily, I think that when it comes to, so we basically have a way of funding sport here in Aotearoa where athletes become carded athletes. So there's a lot of, there has been a lot of articles and research done around that often sports don't get funded here until, you win a gold medal. And then all of a sudden, canoe slalom has all this money flowing into it, and the money is then taken away from other sports. And I think what it does is we do well internationally in that space, but I think a lot of our athletes fall through this carding system after they don't perform well. And so there's quite a few case studies here where obviously there's this real pressure to win, and because winning guarantees the sustainability of your sport, and so I think we do definitely punch above our weight for sure here, I think, in terms of like our population and everything. But I think the space that we don't necessarily do that is at a community level, and actually sometimes, which there is a bit of research being done about this, looking after the athletes as a whole. Like even in Australia they have for example, something that comes to mind is called the Minerva Network. So when athletes finish playing sport or they're coming to the end of their sports career, community funding is then utilised to fund them having a mentor outside of the sports space. So they kind of see sport as this whole journey all the way through, whereas I think previously New Zealand has been quite good at just letting people fall off the edge, really.
Yeah, totally agree. It's there's that whole desire to perform on the international stage, and how we've been kind of renowned for Olympic medals has almost driven some, I want to say bad behaviour. It's maybe controversial, but I think it's bad behaviour from a grassroots level where regional sports organisations are focused, and national bodies as well, and clubs, to be honest, even to that lesser extent, are focusing on the high performance space and are focusing on the top team, or how can we get these elite pathways forming, and just focus on the cream of the crop, which really takes the fun out of sport for a very large percentage of participants, and also neglects the well-being of those higher performing athletes all the time. So yeah.
Because I also think as well, what's something that's really important, and I think is not often a message that's talked about, is that, so maybe we have our 0.6%, right, are the people that we see on TV, and the people who are doing well in sport. But actually there are so many lifelong benefits from everyday people participating in sport and active recreation. If we think about the benefit to society as a whole of people participating in sport and active recreation at any level, it's astronomical, the kind of multidisciplinary things that sport can do to change society. I know Lily and I are both in a space, and I've worked on or kind of helped co-found a young women in leadership program called Whanake o Te Kōpara, where we, all the wahine in that program are involved in sport, but actually you see the change in the dreams they have in their community and the things that they do around creating a women's only space, or women learning how to lift weights, which we know is something that has a huge stigma around it, but actually women need to be lifting weights into their early 60s to reduce around osteoporosis, or people doing research into sport. So most of the sports nutrition and exercise advice comes from research that's done on men. And so we kind of, it's funny, you see this product on TV, but there are all of these lifelong benefits of just everyone participating in sport. And I guess that's always a message that I want to try and say is, a lot of my friends who show up to netball once a week on a social twilight league on a Thursday, it's like, you, just like a silver fern, are gaining so many benefits from doing that. You are not only physical, but, you're getting to go and meet new people. You're having to work with people you don't normally work with. You've had to time manage to get there. There's all these things that I think I'm always passionately advocate for, and so does Lily, around everyone being able to participate in sport and active rec at any level. And I think in Australia they are, they're fantastic. There's not as many funding barriers for our local grassroots organisations, and there really is a much more of a culture of people participating in sport, I think, and I think sport over in Australia as well, something they do a lot of things not well. I should preface that, not recognising
it's not that it's a great place overall.
But from a sports perspective, they were the Suncorp Super Netball. Again, this is an intersection. I always like to talk about the Suncorp Super Netball was the first elite female league in the world to have a maternity leave policy. So they were the first. And again, I just want to preface, it's bare minimum for women to have access to a maternity leave policy. But they were the first league in the world to pioneer that. And they have a really interesting approach where obviously clubs are normally joined together. So they have this idea of shared resources, which I think is a really good way to utilize funding, and also then to tap into a lot of the men's sports where there is a lot of money flowing through.
Yeah, so I guess that was one of the questions which I wanted to ask you about. So about how to grow women's sports, and you just touched upon sort of men's sports being sort of getting some funding from them to sort of to sort of grow women's sports. Is there a way to sort of, I guess a lot of people, particularly on social media, I guess, will say you're siphoning money which you did not earn. Is there a way to sort of counter that narrative?
I think there's kind of two main points that come to mind for me, and maybe Lily will be able to have some others. But I think firstly, it's the idea of equity versus equality is the one I definitely want to start with. When we think about, like I was talking about before, men's rugby in Aotearoa has been established and well run for over a century. So women at the moment are having to compete with having, Super Rugby Aupiki has existed for 3 years. So, and women's
97 years behind.
Yeah. And so we've kind of got that to contest with, but also actually alongside with that comes structures and systems that women's sport are having to operate in that were built specifically by men and for men, and actually to exclude us. There are a lot of legislative things, not only socio-cultural things, but rules and guidelines that specifically excluded us from participating in sport at certain levels. So I think that's always the thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about where money is earned and not, because I think women's sports don't always get the opportunity, New Zealand rugby, to showcase their best. I think the second thing is thinking about when we look at the amount of money that is invested in women's sport versus men's sport, it is just crazy, the difference. And people often comment on, oh, well, the women's sport product isn't as good, or they don't earn as much, they're not earning the viewership, so why should they get XYZ? It's like, well, actually, from any economic perspective, if I invest 10K in my favorite cafe and someone else invests 100K in another cafe, this cafe is going to be able to get all the better equipment, do everything better. And it's things like women. So for the Cricket World Cup that we hosted here in 2021, early 2021, was the first time that they had flown women business class. So when they arrived here, they were able to train straight away. We see all of these things, that there is so many case studies. The women's 2020 World Cup final in 2000, and I want to say it was 2021 as well. We kind of actually had this explosion of, when you lo and behold, when you invest the same amount of money into their players' performance and the facilities, as in paying more money so the women can train on the first field, not the second fields, all those types of things, the product is better. When the product is better, I think they had one of the that 2020 World Cup final had one of the highest viewerships out of any cricket game that Cricket England had hosted. So I think that's definitely a thing, is that when you don't invest the same amount into the product, you cannot expect the same ROI or return on investment. And I think so those are all the money. So we're thinking about a systems approach, that equity versus quality. We're thinking about just a blunt economic approach. But I think thirdly, a point that people often forget, and it's one that a lot of people will experience as amateur athletes, is that, for example, I always rant about it because the inequality is the highest in rugby, our Super Rugby Aotearoa wahine, so they are only contracted, most of them, for 4 or 5 months of the year. Within that, they are only contracted for 4 days a week. So they then have to go and find a job that they can work Monday to Tuesday, who will allow them to have, Monday to Wednesday, who will allow them to have Thursday and Friday off every week, of which most of the women, so one of my friends played for one of the teams, she's also a fellow researcher, she was just running off fumes. They're exhausted. Yeah. And so then they come on TV and people are like, oh, why can't they offer the same product as the men? It's like, because these women are, when you don't get to be being an athlete for your whole life, for your whole being, it's really hard, particularly in a sport where your commodity, unfortunately, the commodity that most people see is your body. And, we know, and that, if we think about our brains and the role that fatigue plays, in sport and life more generally, but, in sport and exercise, the most important thing you can do for your body is rest and sleep and recover. That is how all the good athletes are able to play for as long as possible. But, these women are having to deal with 2 jobs, and then God forbid they get pregnant. God forbid they get an injury. And I also think, while I'm here, I think we're really, really, there is such a double standard on female athletes on what they're allowed to do and not. I've heard a few athletes talk about this, actually, how it's just this culture that in netball, it's just not done to have a drink in the changing room after the game, because I should say they don't have their own changing rooms. But there's this kind of culture around, being these really well put together women that embody societal values. Where there's, we have this other standard for men, this boys will be boys type situation. So yeah, but probably to recap that, I think my main things are always think about equity versus equality, the amount of investment that we give into women's sport or don't, and then thinking about women, you know, being a lot of the time pseudo-professional athletes. I also would always, this is a spot I always want to advocate for this, for anyone who's listening to this. There are so many different ways you can interact with women's sport that will make a big difference, because I feel like at the moment, society has moved forward and how they want to consume women's sport. It's our national sporting organisations and other powers that be that are stuck with values and views that I don't think represent what children now, for example, are experiencing. You know, we want to be able to buy Black Ferns merchandise. I want to be able to buy Opiki merchandise. I want to be able to view sport. You know, I want to be able to view sport not on weird illegal streams, even though it's in Australia. So I think for anyone watching this, the more you can engage with women's sport, the more we give signals to the powers that be that, like, we are actually interested. And that old adage that people don't watch women's sport is untrue. Sky Sport released some numbers the other week that just blew that out of the water. But there's a lot of values, I think, being held true to people's hearts in boardrooms where decisions are made.
Totally. So true. And I think,
Sorry, I've gone on a
like,
complete rant on that, but anyone who will listen, I'm like, you can make a difference.
I was lapping it up, and it's so true that the World Cups and having 3 back to back, rugby, cricket, and football, all hosted in Aotearoa, was so powerful, and it really was a visible display of how much people will get behind women's sport, and also that narrative that it's only women who watch women's sport. Can I just say, women make up 51% of the population. So what if it is only women that watch women's sport? Because we actually are slightly more of the majority. And so if we get all women watching women's sport, that's actually more than the amount of men that watch men's sport. And maybe we're only watching men's sport because we haven't had much opportunity to watch quality women's sport. But then also, like, when I was sitting in some of those games for the Women's Football World Cup, there was dads with their daughters, there was mums with their sons, there was so many men and young boys in those audiences, and you'd hear all these comments being like, "This is amazing! Like, this is so entertaining! Like, this is much more family friendly as an environment. Like, not like men throwing cans of beer around and chanting vulgar chants. And I mean, I go to the men's Phoenix games, so I'm partial to a little bit of that. But you know, it provides that. It provides that environment that's actually a lot more enjoyable for a large percentage of our population. So
yeah,
so many myths to dispel. Hey, we could go on and on.
I this is a stat which I know. Well, stat as in like it's a history fact, which I know that women's football used to get more crowds in England than men's football in the early 1950s until they banned women from playing sports because it was not good for them. And you're just like, you've taken that away and then you're trying to build it up again. And all those lost years. I know this next example is not women related, but it's a sport related thing, which kind of like emphasizes it. In India, football was really big in the 1950s. Like, they made the Olympic semifinals and all that, and then they were banned from football. And so the Indian men's football team was banned from football, and that's when hockey and cricket took up. And now people are trying to grow football again. But they were banned for so many years that nobody played it. And then nobody watched it, and then how is it gonna grow? So, I mean, that same argument, and Erin pointed out so well you say it was a rant, but it was basically like a lecture. It was very informative and clear, and you know you're a lecturer because you're giving all these clear points in succinct manners.
Yeah, firstly, secondly, thirdly, yeah.
I think
so good.
I always want my message to come across.
But about the infancy of sort of women's sporting organizations and the investment it takes, like the NBA did not become this huge thing overnight. It took years and years. in the 60s, no one was watching it, and it had to grow. And it takes some time. It needs that exposure. And yeah, you guys said like having 3 World Cups in Aotearoa really helps exposing not just women's sport, but different types of women's sport, right? Rugby, cricket, football. The more you watch, the more you know you have options.
Totally. And I think, I will say, and I know a lot of other people feel the same. I feel disappointed, I think, thinking about those years of women's sport here, and where we are now in terms of the lack of investment that I think followed up with the success of that. And I think it's a really good example of how, like I'll never forget, honestly, I will never forget being in Eden Park, standing there in a sold out stadium of people coming to watch women's rugby, and that last try that we scored, and things like hearing people knowing all the players' names. And I think it just goes to and that was actually the second time Eden Park had been sold out, so people want it, but we just honestly, the lack of investment we see in women's sport from their own bodies is really hard. And it's disappointing to think that we're almost 3 years on and the women are still getting paid $17,000 before tax to play Super Rugby Aupiki. Like it's costing some of them money. So I think whenever I feel a bit sad about it, I always think about those events. And I think, as you said as well, Lily, like Aotearoa showed up. And I think it was a good example that Aotearoa showed up for the sport, but they also showed up because it was a different product. Hosting that Football World Cup, different communities in Wellington that I didn't know were so big showed up. Like it was, I remember the Football Ferns Philippines game. It was not a nice night. It was a random Tuesday night in the middle of winter in Wellington, and the Filipino population of Wellington just came out. And I don't know, it makes me always think about the role that sport plays in people being able to express their culture and identity, and that women's sport is a real way that people can do that because they can bring their families along.
And I can guarantee you the Filipino communities are loud ones. You would have been hearing them from outside the stadium as well. It'd be like 3,000 people, but they'd make more noise than...
Yeah.
And they won, so I'm still not over that one.
Yeah, that's still a tough fact to think about.
Why'd you bring that up here? And I'm still not over it.
So sorry. Hannah Wilkinson's offside with her hand.
Just because she's tall. Anyway.
Yeah.
I can't have long limbs.
No.
VAR doesn't like that. Concussion injury.
Yeah. There was another point which you brought up, which I wanted to expand on, and that was with the investment, because it's come back and forth to this a lot of times, where like clearly the top level also, particularly in women's sports, does not have that investment, but then also most of the investments which people do end up going to the top. Well, we talked about the All Blacks for rugby mainly, but then I guess even for basketball and all, they go to the top. How do we sort of improve that as well? Because we're talking about the discrepancy between community funding versus top level funding, and I guess when the top are already not getting paid enough in a lot of cases. Yeah, how do you, as some people who work in that field, how do you sort of square that circle?
Yeah, and I hate, I'm going to say this point, I'd like to preface, I don't want to be too harsh on the organisations that are already doing a lot of work, but I think something that I've seen recently, and it always comes back to a big system, doesn't it, is that I think for a long time, a lot of sports here, I think about netball, we're quite heavily reliant on Sky Sport funding, so obviously we think about those kind of neoliberal shifts, and sport being a pay-to-view thing, was able to put a lot of funding into the industry, and it had for so long. And I think what that meant is it stifled people's ability to be able to be creative and commercial in the way that they were thinking, because you just didn't need to. But I think what we've seen recently is over the last few years, Sky Sport has been pulling away their funding from netball. I think obviously because we have a really new TV market now, don't we? Like Sky is not the only place you can view hundreds of different channels. And so we've had to see Netball New Zealand become a little bit more innovative with how they think about funding. I would also say from another systemic place is, you see this in corporates, right? In big corporate organizations, you have people that are like, they're your sales experts. They will go into rooms, they can cut deals, they can talk about money. But they also then, in reflection, get paid a salary that matches that. Whereas because the sports sector, it's not a sector you work in to make lots of money. I find often we struggle to attract those really big commercial brains that could think about how organizations could be funded differently and go to the likes of even what 2 Degrees is doing now, but 2 Degrees, ANZ, and put forward really cool commercial products. I think sometimes the IP for that doesn't exist in the sports sector, but we really need it to help us. But for them, why would you take such a big pay cut? And so I think that's where one of the things starts. And I think, it's a hard market at the moment fiscally to get any type of commercial funding. But I think in an ideal world, I would love to see more funding going into for people seeing a product that's attractive as community level sport. But I mean, honestly, I know that men's sport at the moment is struggling to get naming rights sponsors, and the Pulse have, so it's a tough market. But I think I would love, and we've seen that in the likes of one of the owners of the Northern Kahu was from America, and she somehow got BNZ to purchase all of their tickets for the season. That's quite a cool commercial model. Or the 2 Degrees fighting for fair. So I think there's the expertise in New Zealand, but they don't work in the sports sector because they don't think they'd get remunerated what they're used to or what they probably should be paid. But yeah, I think we need a little bit of a big shake up to think about how we can show people or market sport more as a commodity. But yeah, Lily, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, not necessarily. I have another question that I want to ask, which is a total pivot, but are we pivoting? We're allowed to pivot?
Pivot, go
on. We've sort of touched on it a little bit with talking about the kind of high performance value and visibility of female athletes and the leadership and the role modelling that they can provide. But I'd love, Erin, for you to talk a bit more about how anyone in sport can be a role model and can be a leader, because obviously there's a role that you can play whether you're in a team and you're role modelling to younger teammates or less experienced teammates, or there's a role you can play whether you're a coach just coaching some really low grade basketball on a weekday evening. There's so many ways that you can influence, and I'd love for you to touch on that so that we're not just talking about up here what the big shiny stars are looking like when there's people who are doing awesome stuff and can lead at a grassroots level.
Yeah, so I think probably the first point that I want to touch on, and I think inherently in sport we're quite obsessed with it, and I'm not sure why, is this idea around positional leadership. So I think that often, I guess because in the nature of sports, I think the nature of sport is often that there is seen to be this embedded hierarchy, and often that hierarchy looks like top team, or it looks like captain or coach. And so you have a lot of people who get, and then that flows up into the way sport is governed as well. I think we have a lot of positional recycling in the sector where people get their new role by virtue of having had a previous role. But I think what, a point to articulate is there's only so many positional leadership roles, right? And that doesn't mean that that's the only way to lead. And I think we see a lot of people every day, and hopefully people who are listening to this podcast right now can see themselves in that there are people leading in so many different ways, particularly in sport, because I find often you get people in sport who just genuinely want to help, and so they don't consider themselves as leaders. But it's like the people that are down there volunteer managing the first, second or third 11 and creating a safe space for people to come to after work. Like I think about a lot of the women, like one of the ones I think of is Jog On in Wellington, people who have created safe spaces for women to come and run at all levels. And I think what's the problem with considering people as leaders when they're only in positional leadership titles is that you forget that there's so many different ways to lead. And when we're thinking about, so just linking it back to like the broader picture of sport and the kind of socio-cultural difference it can make, it's not necessarily at high performance level, because I think high performance level is representative of the state that particular sport is in at its grassroots level, right?
Totally.
And probably 98% of people who participate in sport are nervous before they show up to their first training. They, as an older adult, have had to get through some barriers to even make it there. They've gone and bought their first pair of football boots for a long time and they feel a bit silly. And then this person comes to an environment that was created that's safe for them and they can go to, and all of a sudden they're now hooked on football again. They've made some new friends and they're confident and they take that into other phases of their life. And as I said, I think sport is full of amazing volunteers who just don't get the credit that's due for the broader impact I think they're having on society. And leading in so many different ways that are just unseen, and unrecognized. So that's a great question, Lily, and I always love talking about it because I want other people who are seeing this to hopefully look at to change the narrative from, I just do this, or I just play on a Thursday, or I'm just on the team vit committee. It's like, no, if you're on the team vit committee, you're participating in governance, and that means that we need your thinking and your passion on our national level sports boards, to change the sector that we're operating in.
I think that's very well put. It really highlights like the importance. And I think the other thing which you touched upon, which isn't necessarily the main point of what you said, was about sort of making friends and like creating a safe space for people to be able to do that and build community. And I think that becomes increasingly more important, and sports is probably one of the best vehicles to do that, particularly post-COVID. It's become, like, I think personally one of the most important things. I moved to Scotland and almost all my friends are from the sports clubs which I've like joined here. And yeah, it's not that I'm good at it or great at anything, but it's just like it's fun to be around, and it's only because of like volunteers and organizers that you have a space like that to actually do something.
And particularly, I'm not sure if you've seen, there's a statistic which everyone, I think, in the sports sector in Aotearoa is always trying to figure out why does it exist and how can we fix it. There's this thing called the drop-off, isn't there, Lily, around the way that women engage and participate in sport, and particularly young women. So we see quite a substantial drop-off compared to men. So I should say compared to men, quite a substantial drop-off for women between the ages of 16 and 17. And then that gap gets even bigger between the ages of 17 and 19. And so if we kind of think about the lifelong benefits that, people get from participating in sport, and I think particularly for women, when you are, seldom are we in environments where it is female only, and it's not an environment where we're also having to deal with like patriarchal values, is women's sports teams are a really safe space to do that. Like, and, I think about, we have this really disproportionate drop off, and wondering why that exists, and I think about all the women that are missing out on these things. But yeah, that's just something else for if anyone's listening. Sport New Zealand's done a bit of research on the numbers in that, but it's a problem that we're always trying to think about and solve.
Yeah, I've known about this, like the number of friends, I guess, a number of my friends who are girls who played lots of sport in high school, and then as soon as like they went to uni or after, they just don't play anymore. And yeah, not even sort of recreationally. Well, like most of the guys who I know still find some sort of activity, like nowhere near as much as like when we were school kids, but like most of them still sort of play some sport somewhere. I can see it on their Instagram stories from time to time. So yeah, but don't see anything like that for the girls. So yeah, it's interesting. What are the reasons for it? Do you know? Because I feel there'd be a lot that I could think of a few off the top of my head, but anything that you can counteract immediately?
I mean, this is my main thought goes to thinking about, I firstly go back to the point around the value that we place on sport and being good at sport. And I think for women, because I would say it is still not as socially acceptable to participate in sport for women as what you would think. And so I think layering that in, if you've all of a sudden moved to a new city, you were labelled not that great at school, at sport, and then it's also not as acceptable for you to be participating in sport. You know, I think a lot of women feel like the only way that they should be able to play sport is if they're good at it, because that's the only way to kind of overcome this barrier or of what people perceive as being sorry, I'm putting this in quotation marks because I don't believe in it, as being, you know, more masculine or that kind of laddie culture that a lot of people see. So I do think there's a lot of societal values that do play into that. And I think I just think as well, there's not enough safe spaces for women where it's like, hey, like, as in I think about what the Lily Wellington Women's Football Academy did over the off season, where they created a space. It was just for beginners. Like there's all this labeling that I think we need to use as well to encourage women into the space. Because I think men do feel, from what I can see, and kind of is in the research, that men are more confident to go into sporting spaces because I think they feel like they belong there, which is awesome, you know. But for women, there's those barriers. And I always think about my wonderful friend. I'm going to call her a friend. Her name is Robin Coburn, and she's really passionate about active recreation, and she's the kind of person that whenever you drive past a playground or a field, she'll have a statistic for you on the usage of the field. And for women, for example, if you think about a field at a school or a playground, she said that particularly on a field, the boys, 90% of the time, the usage is right in the middle of the field. So ultimately the girls are then relegated to the sides. And why that is relevant is because when we think about, so boys feel the right to be on the field, right in the middle of it, and that's the safe place for them to be. And I'm not hating on that, because I think everyone should be wanting to play in sport, and the systemic things and societal values are not for young children to fix. But then ultimately, I think where that leads into is that women feel like they need to overcome more barriers to participate in sport, because they were never the ones that were welcome in the middle of the field or the centre of the playground. And so there's actually, which any schools are listening and want to talk to me more about this, there's actually a lot of research that's been done on if you can have assigned days on the field, women will play sport, they'll play rugby, they'll play football if it's a woman's only scheduled day. And I do think that really leads into them feeling like sport is a place they belong and they should be able to participate in. And then I think, you know, when you move to a new city or something is more expensive or you don't know anyone and it's scary, if you can remove one of those barriers, like, hey, I've always played social football. Just because I've moved to a new city doesn't mean I shouldn't anymore, you know. So, I mean, I think that a lot of that drop-off exists because, of a lot of the systemic structures that we have, unfortunately. And this is always where my brain goes to big system issues, and they're not easily fixed, but I think can easily be fixed by the culture and the way that we speak to our friends every day about sport and women in sport and all that kind of stuff. So I think we do have the power to influence and change that. But yeah, Lily, as someone who works in that space, what do you see, or anything different, more practical than perhaps my big ideas of how to change the world?
Oh, I 100% agree with what you're saying, but I maybe want to flip it and say that there are a lot of small changes that can be made that make a massive difference, and you've kind of touched on a few of them already. But from like a parent's point of view, how can you, if there's, I don't know if there's any parents of teenage girls listening, how can you encourage your teenage daughters, or even your 11, 12, because it starts earlier than that, how can you encourage them to get outside and kick a ball around, or go try skateboarding or something, some kind of casual recreation that is kind of ingrained, as so here you kind of mentioned, like sport and recreation is ingrained in the sort of male social structures, where it's like that's when you're hanging out with your mates, as you're going and mucking out, playing around on your BMX bikes or kicking a ball down at the park. It's just not really, and I think parents play a role in that as well, where they kind of see their daughter as that doesn't kind of fit for them, or they're kind of encouraging them to do other things. But how can we create those spaces and encourage young girls to actually be getting out and doing that? How can schools create those spaces that are, as you say, Erin, for girls, or kind of give them that safe space? Like if I think of locally, we've got a couple of schools like Aotearoa College, Porirua College in Wellington, who are who are doing girls only sports days, which are led by the students and like the prefects, but ultimately the PE teacher or the dean have enabled, or the principal even have enabled that to happen by saying, hey, so-and-so, do you want to run a girls sports day? Or so-and-so, do you want to use some funding that we've been given to run a girls only climbing course, which is something I've just heard has been happening, where girls are wanting to do rock climbing, but they're wanting to do it in their own safe way. And then when you get to that age where you're past the drop off, and you're at university, or you've been in full-time employment for a little while, or you've had kids and you haven't played sport at all, or you haven't played sport since you were maybe 13, 14, how do you create a space that's safe to say, hey, if you rock up and you have never held a hockey stick, or you've never kicked a ball before, that's okay, and we'll teach you the basics. Because even as someone who has played football since I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, there's some basics that I was just never taught, because there was such less investment and support and resource for girls football back then, that there wasn't the coaches to teach me. And so now I'm in my late 20s, and I'm being taught how to kick a ball properly, which I was never taught. So it's just, it's revolutionary, and I think it's so much easier than we think it is. But it just takes those amazing people to just have an idea and just run with it, like the women's football centre. Shout out to Kimberly. Hit them up on Instagram.
Sorry, while we're here, just one other thought that I had, and it's, I guess, a thought and a challenge I would like to lay out too, is that I think that when we think about the commodification of sport, and then, further, I was talking about what an asset, one of our biggest assets in sport is our physical body. And I think when you think about the broader societal views on women's bodies and what healthy looks like for women, we're very, very harshly judged on that. And then when we think about a lot of the uniforms that women have to wear, so I think about netball, right, as one of the biggest participated sports, and a lot of women do pick it up at a later age, but having to wear a dress, those dresses just really cling onto every bit of your body that society makes you feel uncomfortable about. And, we even see that. So I used to play beach handball. Obviously, that was a very crude example. We had to wear bikinis. But I think when we think about why a lot of women perhaps also drop off or stop playing sport is that, we are so harshly judged for our bodies and the way they look. And there is obviously a certain perception, which I love. A fantastic researcher called Dr. Stacey Sims is really debunking a lot of what healthy looks like for women. But I think for women who maybe aren't feeling as comfortable in their bodies, feel like they're actually not entitled to participate in sport because they're not healthy. And so I think this is where, again, linking it back into, I was thinking about your original questions here around thinking about the different, we think about the intersections between sport and these really broad societal values and views that are still held about women and us, and they just intersect at almost, every facade or facet of sport, I think. So I definitely think thinking about body image and the way society makes us feel about our bodies perhaps means that some people feel like they don't belong or they're not supposed to play sport. Just wanted to add that in there because I think it's really important to talk about, especially for young women.
Totally.
Agreed 100%. Just because we've been recording for about an hour, and I am...
Oh, me and Lily really can't talk.
Been yapping too much, sorry.
and unfortunately, I need more money to upload longer episodes.
Get funding for Smooth Brain.
Yeah, we need that as well. So if people can like, subscribe, follow, that will really help me out. Then we can get Erin on again to talk more. But just to wrap up, are there any other things which we didn't touch upon which you guys would like to this time? Would love to have you guys on more to talk, keep having the discussion, but any sort of final thoughts?
I think probably just my final thought is that even if it's small or big, engaging with or participating in women's sport genuinely does make a really big difference in terms of thinking about funding and elevating it and I think I'd also like to challenge everyone who's listening to reflect on the ways in which they participate and can contribute to sport, and recognise that what they're probably doing is making a really substantial difference for someone else's life.
That's awesome. So, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Lily, for co-hosting and coming on. And thank you, Erin, so much. It was great having you. And yeah, thank you everybody for listening. So yeah, until next time, take care and bye-bye.